Hey, good evening. Hope everybody had a great weekend. We've seen improving weather here in Texas. We've got a little bit of a decrease in cloud cover, but the temperatures are definitely coming up and getting into that tail end of September as we start. We got the days shortening. We're losing about 1.5 to 2 minutes each day. But some good news. Looking pretty good out there in the Atlantic. I guess if you like extreme weather, this isn't all that great, but in terms of hazards, we're looking at pretty good here. Just got Joyce out there south of the Azores, and that's just kind of drifting around, and that's not going to be a threat to the U.S. Focusing in on Texas. There's those 90s back, and also dew points in the low 70s. If we draw a isodrosotherm, I think we're going to find the 70s up there in Arkansas, and that 70 line will come down through about Jacksonville, out to about just east of Austin. And yeah, I think that's just going to continue on to south of San Antonio there. So that's all the deeper moisture. And north of that, 60s dew points, which is actually pretty typical for this time of year. No sign of the dry line. That moisture has definitely infiltrated far east Texas, and it's pretty much all the way out into New Mexico there. Now, on the flip side of things is the Arctic. There's a lot of weather going on up there right now. Things have really been moving up there the past 2 weeks or so. And here we can see temperatures in the teens and 20s through much of the high Arctic region. We've got this Bear Clinic low just south of Resolute, and we've got a pretty strong cold front south of that, and you can see the very strong winds coming in back and behind that, heading towards the southeast there. So that's kind of a sign of what's going to be coming here soon. Maybe not next week, but sometime over the next month or two. And there's actually some interesting developments in the GFS, which we'll be going over shortly. Up to the north, you can see the polar anticyclone up there, and the winds have got that clockwise curl right there, and that places a polar high right there north of the north slope of Alaska. All right, and then just focusing in on the rest of the U.S., there's a quick look at the surface map. Not a whole lot going on really, but the details that I would be looking for when I see this map would be the influence of the Bermuda High extending all the way back to Texas right there. So we got that southerly flow bringing the moisture up from the Gulf. Up in the Great Lakes area and the western Midwest, we've got this stationary front. Well, it's kind of a weak cold front right there. There's really not much of an air mass back in behind it in this region. You can see a little bit, maybe a 1016 millibar high. That's not very much, so I would expect this front to maybe slow down just a little bit there. In contrast, we've got a stronger cold front up there in Montana and North Dakota. And back in behind that, 1020 millibar high, that's definitely a lot stronger, and you can see the stronger pressure gradient from Wyoming up to Saskatchewan. So that's going to be helping to drive that air mass and bring that southeastward. Okay, heading to the rest of the maps, well, we've got Florence out of the pattern. We remember the past couple of days we saw it take a track kind of like that and across Pennsylvania and New York. And this is the precipitation. This is a 7-day radar-derived precipitation there. And the white shades in North Carolina, that's 20 inches right there. The cutoff for 10 is going to be the magenta color right there. Again, that's in the Carolinas. And then the 5-inch is going to be the transition between orange and red. Again, that's in the Carolinas. So it looks like, and Charleston, West Virginia there, JavaScript responding. And there it is right there. That's the remnants of Florence on its way out, producing a little line of thunderstorms there in the Delmarva area and Long Island. It's also pretty quiet. Most of the action has been in Iowa, around the Des Moines area, around Davenport, and back to Omaha. So just some isolated wind and hail reports in that area, and no watches in effect. All right, so let's do the thickness and isobar analysis. And this is a very, if I had to pick any chart out of Incept's products, if I could only choose one, I think it would be this one. Red lines, you see these red lines off the California coast here. When these red and blue lines, doesn't matter which color they are, when they're close together, that outlines a thermal gradient. So what I'm going to do is outline these thermal gradients that far. I'm going to say this is a thermal gradient. Advection is really what determines whether there's baroclinicity there. But there you go right there. That's the thermal gradients we have to work with. And what we want to do is relate that to the surface systems. You can see back here in Iowa and Washington, there's a couple of low-pressure areas. There's a few more in Colorado. Now, these ones in Colorado, those are away from that thickness zone right there. So this is actually in a barotropic environment, and this is actually lee side troughing, which we see when we have strong flow coming across the Rockies. Okay, so that leaves us with this one. I'm going to paint it a little bit different, maybe diagonal right there. These lows, those lows are pretty much sitting right along that thermal gradient. It doesn't have to be in the center. In fact, it's really good if it sits on the warm side of the gradient, like just like you see right here. So that right there is definitely a baroclinic zone. Okay, I'm just taking a quick look at the stream software, and I can see that we dropped about 3,000 frames earlier. So, yeah, this is what I'm looking at right here. 3,200. Okay. So we had a little bit of a drop-off earlier. It seems to be okay right now, so we're just going to keep going. Okay, so there's that thermal gradient right there. That zone right there is our baroclinic low. And extending from that baroclinic low, which is basically a frontal low, is a front. And that goes down just like that right there. And this goes out like there. So that's sitting on the equatorward side of that thermal gradient. Okay, so that's actually pretty easy. Okay, any other lows and highs? Well, we've got the oceanic high pressure way out here off the edge of the map. This is definitely away from that thermal zone, so this is going to be a barotropic system. And that's actually a warm core high. That's a subtropical high. It's basically the Bermuda high or Azores high, whatever you want to call it there. So that's what that system is, and that extends all the way inland into the southeast U.S. Another system up to the north is this polar high across Quebec, Labrador, and Baffin Island. So that's sitting maybe a little bit north of that thermal gradient, so that's probably a polar air mass in a developmental stage right there. So it's radiating away heat, and if it starts sliding south a little bit, maybe we may see a little bit of baroclinicity in that. And then up to the Northwest Territories, that's a little bit off the top of the map right there. There's that strong low-pressure area that's located right there, and we can see that's definitely in a baroclinic zone. There's a couple of thickness lines right there. So that's supporting a cold front extending down into the Canadian prairies right there. And probably a very weak warm front up to the north. So that's the next system coming into central Canada right there, and that's actually being supported by this high-pressure area across the north slope of Alaska and out into the Arctic Ocean there. In this, you can see the blue lines running right through that high. That is a baroclinic high. So that's a frontal high, very classic, and it's a little bit different from this high, which is sitting to the north of that gradient right there. So this one out here is a little bit more active. And then we have the Pacific high. Well, there's a couple of lines running through that showing that there is a little bit of baroclinicity, there's thermal advection and stuff like that going on. But the system as a whole, it's a semi-permanent system, and that's more of a barotropic high, which is it's basically another subtropical high right there. So we're not going to really expect to find the jet running right on top of that high. Most likely it's going to be up to the north where we see some of this advection going on in the northern part of that system right there. Okay, check and drop frames looks good there. I think we've gotten past the snags there. So let me just check in on chat and see what happened. Make sure things are looking good right now. We've got Carl Burkhoff there, and Greg Porter, Bell Bottom Girl, Lily Greenway, and Adam Davis up in Indianapolis, or I should say Indiana. Tarantula, chilly and rainy and gloomy Minneapolis. Funwood Tech, and Greg Porter, Erica Baker in Southeast Kansas, 89/69. Bill K. Thomas Copeland, Mike R. Ryan Toomeys, and Mike R. reporting it's cooler than normal in the San Francisco area, and we can certainly see that on this surface chart here. So the thermal gradient is right in that area, and this area right here, that's a cold polar air mass, and we have actual cold air advection coming in from North California and along the Pacific coast right there. So that's helping to cool things down in much of California. Okay, let's see. Ryan Toomeys, 92 degrees there. Storms on the west coast there. And one thing that we were going to talk a little bit about was polar vortex and Arctic air masses. That's what I have right there in the title. So we're getting into that season where we need to start kind of preparing for some of this stuff. And I've got a couple charts here to kind of help illustrate some of this stuff. So we're going to get everything centered there. And you can see we're looking at a case study in July of 2013. So this is a summertime chart. And here is North America right there. Okay, and the U.S. is right in here. Whoop, a little bit south. Okay, so there's the Great Lakes right there, and Canada up to the north, and here's Alaska. And then this other stuff up here, this is Asia, and then Europe is over here. And, of course, the North Pole right there. Okay, so what are we looking at? We've got a kind of a weak upper-level system right there. You can see a jet across the northeast U.S. right there. But overall pretty quiet, just a couple weak waves moving through the flow. And we're going to set this into motion and kind of get a look at summertime patterns. You can see a couple of lows up in the Great Lakes area, and I should let you know this is 300 millibars, so this is up at 30,000 feet, the top of the troposphere. Okay, so we're going into August of 2013. So I'm kind of acclimating you to the progression of the systems. You can see that they're kind of circulating around counterclockwise. And you might notice that there's a lot of lows right around the polar area. See, now we're up to September. This is September 7th, September 8th. So you notice that the green, which indicates winds, that's really strengthened quite a bit. So things are starting to cool down, and what we have here is this semi-permanent low-pressure area sort of centered on the North Pole there. And that's basically the polar vortex right there. Now, another definition of the polar vortex that you might encounter is the stratospheric polar vortex. And that's similar, but a little bit different because that extends up to 100 to 150, sometimes 200,000 feet there. And that is supported by other processes. You know, there is some overlap there. However, what we focus on when we're talking about 300 millibars, this is a tropospheric polar vortex there. And then you notice around the ring, down in the tropical regions, all the way around, we've got this high pressure zone. And that's due to warm air. Warm air has a lot of volume, and a lot of the atmosphere is kind of displaced upwards. So we find the 300 millibar level a little higher than what we usually would. So 300 millibars, this is actually kind of a good substitute for your air masses, their temperatures. So where we have this low pressure area up in the polar regions, low pressure aloft, that is basically indicating cold air. Mostly in the low levels, but the deeper that cold air mass is, the more of a reflection it's going to have at 300 millibars there. So a lot of your more intense polar air masses with very great depth, like the ones that punch southwest into the western U.S., those are going to definitely have troughing at 300 millibars there. These polar lows are not going to get all the way down into the U.S. That's really rare. However, I'm going to show you an example. We're going to push on until we're up to September. You're going to see the flow strengthen here. Very good Pacific system coming in. You can see that kind of impact the west coast there, breaks up into waves. So that's producing some weather there. So we're up to October of 2013. You can see this blocking ridge kind of gets set up in western Canada. And we move on into November. So the flow is really strengthened there. It's kind of hypnotic there, isn't it? And let's see, starting out in early December, you can see this really impressive trough aloft, and this is representing very intense polar air across the northern U.S. and central Canada. This is December 6th of 2013. Now, that polar air mass is not really going to make it into the U.S. just yet because of this very strong southwesterly flow. We really want to have northwesterly flow crossing that air mass. So it looks like here it comes. Yeah, here comes some northerly flow, and that's about to cross over that area where that polar air mass was developing, and that's going to push it into the eastern U.S. right there. And then you see that troughing associated with the displaced polar air across the central U.S. And then I'll bring you up to early January, where Chicago, the Midwest, was getting hit pretty hard by cold air, and they called it the polar vortex storm. That was around January 6th or January 7th. And that was right about here. There it is, January 6, 2014. Now, the polar vortex was actually still across the Arctic. There was one little lobe across Ontario, so this was not really a polar vortex storm. I definitely wouldn't call it that. And I even checked the 10 millibar, 50 millibar, the stratospheric charts, and there was no polar vortex sitting across the Great Lakes area. So there's a little bit of misinformation about that, but altogether, you know, this is still pretty intense. So a very, very strong trough across the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River region. And you can see a little bit of a blocking high in the western Canadian region, and that's helping to shape this kind of northwesterly flow coming into the central U.S. So this is a pattern that we see a lot associated with cold outbreaks into the U.S. All right, so that's about as much as I want to cover as far as that goes. I figure kind of a bite-sized thing would be better. And we'll come back to some of that information over the next few weeks. So let's head into the forecast. Maybe some of the satellite data too. Anyway, yeah, there's some higher precipitable water coming up into the Mississippi River region. This is 1 to 1.5 inch amounts, making it all the way up to Iowa and Illinois there. So we'll check out a little bit of that on the soundings. Let's try pulling the Davenport sounding up. Okay, there's what we have out of Davenport there. Impressive lapse rate from 850 all the way up to 700, 650 there. The moisture is a little bit lacking in that area, but you can see northwesterly flow in that region and very shallow southerly flow. All right, so I probably can't talk too much about that without looking at the surface chart. I'll try moving over to Lincoln, Illinois. Also, moisture looks a little bit weak there. Looks like 68-degree dew point near the surface, falling off to 50s up at about 5,000 feet. So if we were going to construct a parcel, you can see there's some capping right down in here. So a little bit of negative cape there, or convective inhibition is what we call it there. And then closer to home here, the Dallas sounding looks like this. And that shows that we have definitely dried off a bit, but still looking at 60s dew points in the lower levels. And constructing a parcel, you can see a little bit of weak capping there, and a little bit of cape up there in the mid-atmosphere there. Some impressive easterly winds. So we'll look for that on the upper level chart. That's typically something that we only see in the late summer in the south central U.S. So we'll check out the upper level pattern and see what's going on there. That's pretty much indicating a piece of a subtropical high up to the north. And there it is. East-northeast winds, Shreveport and Dallas. And if we draw the streamlines, they're going to look like that right there. So subtropical high across West Texas there. And a piece of the subtropical ridge extending into Missouri like that right there. So the deep westerlies are still way up to the north at this point. And I'm kind of wondering when that's going to change, when we're going to finally break down this ridge. Down to the south, I do see a little bit of a tropical depression offshore there. There it is. Then the wind flow is just coming around kind of like that, painting out a cyclonic curve around that system. All right, we'll look at the satellite data. Go region by region and see fires are a problem. Put that into motion. Yeah, see, starting out earlier in the day, looks like they have the fires out or under control. And there's one right there. There's a couple more around Jackson Hole. Those went up pretty quickly there. And very likely due to that frontal low out in this area today. That's probably helped pick the gradient up quite a bit. Usually to the east, frontal lows in the Great Basin area in the western U.S., that does tend to be very windy. Places like Vegas, Salt Lake City, when you're east of those frontal lows, that'll really pick up the winds. And yeah, it looks like that has compounded problems in Wyoming and Utah there. Monsoon continues to be on the downturn there in the Four Corners area, New Mexico and Arizona. Looks like it's flared up just a little bit out around the Tucson area, Deming, Silver City, Lordsburg. But for the most part, most of this is kind of localized and not very much northward extent. Things are pretty dry up there in Utah and Colorado. In the northern plains, they're under the influence of that surface front. We can kind of see some of that barreling down through Iowa and Nebraska there. So we'll kind of watch that on the loop right there. And in the wake of that, we can see a little bit of stratocumulus, probably a little bit of isentropic lift going on in that area. Cold air advection coming down south. And you can see the thunderstorms have a strong affinity for those boundaries. So right down here, there's the front, one very active convective top right there, and then some older cells stretching from northeast Missouri all the way out towards Springfield. Down in Texas, pretty quiet today. You can see the cumulus flaring up right there. But overall, not much development. Very quiet. Even the sea breeze seems to be taking a bit of a break there. Northeast U.S. is seeing the outgoing remnants of Florence, and there it goes out there along the east coast there. In the wake, some northwesterly flow coming in. And then for the southeastern U.S., we'll roll that loop right there. Sea breeze active at around Lake Okeechobee there into the Everglades, and looks like we picked up a little bit of a westerly pattern across Georgia there. I can see those anvils spreading out to the west there. So they're not quite under that easterly pattern like we have in Texas, so it's a little bit different in that area there. Okay, now the forecast. Because we do have big changes on the way. I'm going to skip the Texas map because there's nothing going on. And we'll start with the upper level map. This is up at 500 millibars. So starting out, it's pretty quiet in the U.S., kind of zonal, west to east flow across the northern tier states there, but very active up there in Canada. Very strong vortex up there in the Northwest Territories, and there's that northwesterly flow coming down from the Arctic region. All right, so moving forward, one good trough coming on shore, and if you remember what we were talking about with these troughs, those represent cold air in the low levels. So that's one reason my car is getting some very comfortable weather there in the Bay Area. So that right there, reflection of the cold air making its way onshore. And we can see that that cold air is going to make some progress inland tomorrow and Thursday. So that'll be affecting the Great Basin area next. Looks like a bit of a blocking pattern up there in Alaska. And this has got kind of the look of a Rex block there. So up here we have high pressure Down here we have low pressure. So this is kind of inverted from what we usually see. Typically we have low pressure up to the north and high pressure down to the south. So that in itself is a block right there. So this Rex block, keeping things a little bit locked up. And let's see what the next development is. Well, that trough from the western U.S. is going to come out Thursday, Friday into the northern U.S., Minnesota and the Dakotas. And then down in the southern U.S., let's see what's going on in that region. I think that northerly flow we have in Texas, that northeasterly or easterly flow, I think that's going to break up because you can see the subtropical ridge right there with those closed contours. And then as we move forward, it looks like that actually breaks up and moves out towards Memphis there. So now we start to open up some southerly flow into Texas. That might help bring the sea breeze a little bit further north over the next couple of days there. And yeah, this trough approaching, that's another factor there. So the weekend is looking about like this right here. This is Friday night. Zonal flow across much of the U.S. That trough across the northern U.S. lifts out very quickly across the Great Lakes area. And here comes round 2 coming in from the Pacific Northwest. Down to the south, I can see a little bit of tropical disturbance there in southern Florida for Saturday. Let me back this up, see where that came from. Yeah, that's something from this trough right there. It looks like that swings around kind of like that. Little mesoscale feature, I think, right there. Yeah, there it is right there. Crossing Miami midday Friday, so probably a lot of showers in that area. And that'll be heading into the Gulf over the weekend. And you can still kind of follow it right there going into Monday. Okay, so let's see. Oh, the little trough is going to come on shore midweek. There it is right there, coming into the Houston area for Tuesday and Wednesday next week. And yeah, things have really changed. Midweek next week. Look at all this troughing. That's really quite a change in the pattern there. So this represents obviously a lot of cold air coming southward. So 25th, 1 week from now, things are gonna be a lot different, especially in the northern plains and the western Midwest region. And back behind it, somebody left the barn gate door open right there with that very broad northwesterly flow, and that should bring in a whole lot of cold air closing out September here. So we got a lot coming up here next week. A couple of short waves coming in back in behind that in the wake of that system. That might produce some showers, maybe some snow showers up in the northern tier states there. And then we start opening up the Pacific. Here comes one good trough inland around the 30th, and then this other one looks like it's trying to sync up. And wow, look how meridional the pattern is. So I'm going to draw out the jet. Yeah, that's definitely anything but zonal there. That's very... Things are going to be looking interesting here later next week. And looks like a block here. There's a Rex block, high pressure up in Alaska and low pressure down in the Pacific right there. So we may be hanging on to this pattern here going into October there. And that's probably about as far as I want to get there, but yeah, wow. I mean, you look at this, early October, compare that to what we have now. That's quite a bit different there. Okay, well, that's about all I got for this evening. Let me just take one last look at chat there. I'll just have to kind of skim through this real quickly. A little discussion about football there. 2010, the year of the Supermax polar vortex. And let's see here. Okay. Joe Desert Gardner reporting no rain there in Tucson. Well, that might change because things are getting very active out in the western U.S. It seems like fall is going to come kind of early to a lot of the U.S. here. All right, that's about all I got for today. I hope you all have a good evening. Take care, and we will see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.